Glad you made it. I know it was a harrowing journey starting late last night, and we're glad you're here. So if there are no further comments on favorably reporting the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coombs.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Mr. Rono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No.
Mr. Corning.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Sass.
No.
Mr. Hawley.
No.
Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 11 yeas, 11 nays. It's a tie vote.
The committee has recorded a tie vote on Judge Jackson's nomination to be the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress, I'll transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of this tie vote. Next, we will vote on Judge Stephanie Davis, nominated to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coombs.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Mr. Rono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy. Oh.
Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 12 yeas, 10 nays.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Next, unless someone seeks recognition, we'll consider the nomination of Robert Huey to be the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California. Does anyone, I'm sorry, please excuse me. I'm sorry, on the previous roll call, would the clerk restate the vote?
13 yeas, 9 nays.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Now, our next vote is Ariana Freeman, nominated to the Third Circuit. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coombs.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Mr. Rono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Corning.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Sass.
No.
Mr. Hawley.
No.
Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 11 yeas, 11 nays.
The committee has recorded a tie vote on Ms. Freeman's nomination to be U.S. Circuit Judge for the Third Circuit pursuant to Section 3 of subsection 1A of the Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I'll transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of the tie vote. Next, we vote on the nomination of Robert Huey to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coombs. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Rono. Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Pass.
Mr. Corning.
No.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Sass.
No.
Mr. Hawley.
No.
Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy? No. Mr. Tillis? Mrs. Blackburn? No. Chair Durbin?
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 12 yeas, 10 nays, 1 pass.
The nomination,
I'm sorry, 11 yeas, 10 nays, and 1 pass.
11, 10, and 1 passed, you say?
Yes.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. We will now vote on Evelyn Padine, nominated to the District of New Jersey. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy?
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein?
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse?
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Coons?
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal?
Aye.
Mr. Rono? Mr. Booker?
Aye.
Mr. Padilla?
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Grassley?
No.
Mr. Graham?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning?
No.
Mr. Lee?
No.
Mr. Cruz?
No.
Mr. Sass?
No.
Mr. Hawley?
No.
Mr. Cotton?
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy?
No.
Mr. Tillis? Mrs. Blackburn? Chair Durbin?
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 12 yeas, 10 nays.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Up next is the nomination of Jennifer Reardon to the Southern District of New York. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy?
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein?
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse?
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar? Mr. Coons?
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Rono? Mr. Booker?
Aye.
Mr. Padilla?
Aye.
Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Grassley?
Aye.
Mr. Graham?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Aye.
Mr. Cruz? Mr. Sass? Mr. Hawley?
Aye.
Mr. Cotton?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Tillis? Mrs. Blackburn? Chair Durbin?
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 22 yeas.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Last on our agenda is Vanessa Avery, nominated to be U.S. Attorney for the District of Connecticut. Anyone seek recognition? Senator Blumenthal.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to put a statement in the record if there's no objection.
I'm sure there will not be.
And I'd just like to say how proud I am of this nomination, having held this job myself. She is a trial attorney with broad experience, enormous expertise, and superbly qualified for this role, serving the people of Connecticut. And I thank the members of the committee, hopefully, for your approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy?
Aye.
Mrs.
I'm s-
Feinstein?
I'm sorry. Excuse me. There may not be a need for a roll call vote.
No, there's no need for a roll call.
Okay, all those in favor of this nomination say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. Pending the chair, the ayes have it, and the nomination is agreed to. Senator Lee recorded as no, Cruz as no, Hawley as no. So the nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. With that, this meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee is adjourned.